Hello and welcome back to another PC build. Today I've teamed up with Team Group, BQuat and ASRock to make this guide to building a video editing PC. And this is going to be another full step-by-step PC build guide where I'm going to be showing you how to put all the parts I've got in front of me together today to come up with a fully working PC by the end of the video. As well as showing you how to put everything together, I'll show you how to install Windows 10, any programs and drivers we're going to need to get our PC up and running. I'll show you how to install the RGB software and give you a demonstration of how it works. I'll show you how to enter the BIOS. If our motherboard needs a BIOS update, I'll show you how to do that. And I'll show you how to adjust the fan curves. I'll then run some benchmarks focused mainly on content creation to give you an idea of the performance that we can get from this PC. So just before we go through the parts, I think the first thing to cover is what makes a video editing PC different from a gaming PC. And I think the answer to that really depends on who you are and what your needs are, because there can actually be no difference at all, because in general a PC that's good for playing games on is generally going to be good for video editing. Depending on what your workflow is, there may be some optimizations that you're going to want to make the PC more focused for video editing. And that's what we're going to cover when we look at each of the individual parts. So let's make a start with the case. For the case, I've gone with BQuat Silent Base 802 in white. So this is a case that I know fairly well. I've done a full step-by-step PC build guide in it. I've done an awful lot of thermal testing in this case, so I know what hardware works and how you should set it up to get the most from this case. And I think probably the biggest endorsement that I can give this case is this is what I'm using for my personal system. So I really like this case. So what makes this case particularly good for content creation and for making a video editing PC? So I think the first thing is the clue is in the name. This is named the Silent Base 802. And when I did my thermal testing in this case, I was impressed both with the thermals, but also the noise levels. And I think if you're working on content creation, you really don't want a noisy PC beside you. Having a PC that you can't really hear and you can focus just on what you're actually working on is very important to me. And I do a lot of video editing, and one of the things I really focused on when I'm building PCs is the noise level. And with the PureWings 2 fans in this case, you're not going to be disappointed when it comes to noise levels. Another thing that's really important to me when I'm editing videos is I don't want the PC to be a distraction. We've already covered the noise distraction, but if we have a PC that's got lots of flashing RGB on it, I would find that very distracting when I'm editing videos, and the RGB is going to be flashing off the screen and it's going to really affect my performance editing videos. So I've been very careful in choosing this case. It doesn't actually have any additional RGB in it. And again, the other components that we're going to come to, I've picked them for that particular reason as well. Another thing that I think is important when choosing a case for a video editing PC is you're going to want to have plenty of space for drives. And this is a fairly large case and you're not going to be short of space to put drives. The PC has a hard drive cage down the bottom, but as well as that, you can actually install 5 3.5-inch drives in the main compartment of the case. There's also 3 dedicated 2.5-inch drive mounting locations in the rear compartment. I personally tend to use mostly M.2 SSDs when I'm video editing, and I don't actually use any 3.5-inch hard drives. But again, it's nice to have the option should I wish to do that in the future. Moving on to our CPU, when you're deciding which CPU to go with for a gaming PC, you'll look at the benchmarks. So we need to do exactly the same when we're building a video editing PC. It is important that you know which software package you're going to be using to edit your videos in, because each of them will respond to different hardware in different ways. And a certain CPU and GPU combination might be good for one package, but be a really bad choice for another. I personally use DaVinci Resolve when I'm editing videos for the channel, so that's what I'm going to focus on when looking at the specs for this particular PC. If you're new to video editing, there's a few reasons I would recommend starting with DaVinci Resolve. The first is the free package that they offer is incredibly good. It's not like other software companies where the free version is only for a trial period or it's incredibly slimmed down from the paid version. The free version is an incredibly good video editing package. They do offer a studio version. The last time I checked it was around about £300 for the studio version, but that's a one-off payment. There's no ongoing subscriptions and whenever they release a new version of the studio version, you can upgrade to it for free. I use a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera 4K, and whenever I bought it, it was around about £1,000, and it came with a DaVinci Resolve Studio license for free. So that's another way you can actually get it for pretty good value. So bringing things back to our CPU choice for our video editing PC, focusing on DaVinci Resolve, I think the best place to go to look at the benchmarks is Puget Systems. When I was building my first video editing PC, this is where I explored things and helped me decide on what components to go with. Looking at their benchmarks, we can see it's mostly AMD CPUs at the top of the list, with the high core count Threadripper CPUs performing the best. The new Ryzen 5000 series CPUs perform particularly well, particularly the Ryzen 9, 12 and 16 core CPUs. It's also interesting to note that the Zen 3 processors also bring a good bump up in performance compared to the previous generation, with the 5900X offering 8% improved performance over the 3900 XT. So obviously which CPU you go for is going to be determined by your budget and your workflow, but I find these benchmarks really helpful for getting the right price to performance. So for today's build, I've gone for the Ryzen 9 5900X, which is a 12-core, 24-thread CPU, which should give us some great performance in DaVinci Resolve, but it'll also work well for general computing. For the motherboard, I've gone with ASRock's X570 Tai-Chi Razer Edition. The big difference between this motherboard and the regular X570 Tai-Chi is that this motherboard has Razer Chroma RGB built directly into the motherboard. So you're going to be able to use Razer signups to control all the RGB on the motherboard and anything else you plug into the RGB headers. The other advantage I think this motherboard gives you is I really like the all black aesthetic much better than the original Tai-Chi. So how does a motherboard for a video editing PC differ from a gaming PC? And in general, with a video editing PC, I would recommend going for a slightly higher spec motherboard, and there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, with a video editing PC, you're generally going to be using a higher powered CPU, which is going to have more cores. And if you want to get all those advantages from that CPU, you need a slightly better motherboard to get the full potential from your CPU. And this is a top-of-the-line motherboard with a 16-phase power design, so it's not going to have any trouble at all running our 5900X. Another really important thing with a video editing PC, particularly for my workflow, is the number of M.2 SSD slots that the motherboard has. Most X570 boards will have 2 M.2 slots. There is a few that will have 3, and this is one of those motherboards. The other really nice advantage of this is that all 3 of the M.2 slots will support Gen 4 speeds. Another thing that I think is really important when picking a motherboard for a video editing PC is making sure you've got enough ports when it comes to connectivity, because you're going to want to plug in a lot of peripherals and you may want to transfer data at quite a high speed. One of the real advantages this motherboard offers, it actually has a Thunderbolt AIC header. So you can use ASRock's Thunderbolt add-in card to add Thunderbolt connectivity to your build, which is quite a rare thing on AMD motherboards. For me, I don't use Thunderbolt in my workflow, so I'm not going to be doing this today, but it's a nice option to have for the future should I go down that route. For RAM, I've gone with 32 gigabytes of Team Group's T-Create Classic 10L RAM at 3200 MHz. So Team Group's new T-Create lineup is mainly geared at creators, and there's a few features in this RAM kit that make it perfect for our needs in a video editing PC. So it has a 10-layer PCB, and it has a high temperature resistant capacitor, which makes it stable in high temperatures. And this is very important when you're using it for video editing, because in general you can use quite a large capacity of the RAM for a long period of time. The other big advantage of this RAM kit is it offers plug and play functionality when it comes to the RAM frequency. It will run at the full 3200 MHz without us needing to go into the motherboard BIOS and enable the XMP profile, which is great if you don't want to do that or don't know how to do it. So the amount of RAM that you're going to need is going to be one of the big differences between a video editing PC and a gaming PC. So with a gaming PC, in general, 16 gigabytes is still the sweet spot for most things. With a video editing PC, looking at Puget Systems' guide, If you're going to be editing in 4K in DaVinci Resolve, they're recommending a minimum of 32 gigabytes of RAM. If you're going to be using higher resolutions, they're recommending a minimum of 64 gigabytes. I edit mostly in 4K, so 32 gigabytes is going to be perfect for us. Moving on to storage, Team Group have sent out their Cardia Zero Z440 NVMe M.2 SSD in 1TB capacity. However, 1TB of capacity isn't going to work very well for a video editing PC. And for example, the 4K files that I'm editing today in Blackmagic B-RAW are probably going to come to about 1TB of size for just one video. So we're going to need more storage than this. So as our motherboard does support up to 3 M.2 SSDs, I'm going to occupy all the slots, and I've got 2 more Gen 4 drives. So I've got a Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus in 2TB capacity and a Samsung 980 Pro in 1TB capacity. So even if your workflow is different to mine and you're not going to be editing in 4K, you're maybe going to be doing 1080p and you're not going to be doing that long videos, I still would recommend going for more than one drive. In general, I would recommend having your operating system and all your programs on one drive and keeping your video files on a second drive. And I do recommend the same when I'm building a gaming PC. Keep all your programs and Windows on one drive and your game files on another. And the reason for that is you don't want to fill up the drive that's got your operating system on it and then limit its performance. With video editing, the programs are going to have to be accessing all the files, and if that's on the same drive as your operating system, that is going to limit its performance. For the CPU cooler, I've gone with BQuat's Pure Loop 360mm AIO. So I've used this CPU cooler in a number of builds before and always been impressed with the noise, the thermals, but also the aesthetics. So the water block itself just has a nice white LED glow around the outside of it, and there's no RGB on any of the fans. So it's going to fit in really well with the aesthetic of this build. Moving on to the GPU, and again we're going to need to go back to Puget Systems benchmarks to help us decide which GPU to go with. So I think the big thing that you're going to notice here is that while AMD was the way to go when it comes to your CPU, NVIDIA seems to be the way to go for your GPU, looking mainly at DaVinci Resolve. And I think to illustrate that point, if you look at the charts, you'll notice that a 3060 Ti outperforms a 6900 XT. So again, when deciding which GPU to go for a video editing PC, it's going to be determined by your budget, but also your workflow. And it is important to decide what package you're going to be using beforehand, because some packages don't really use the GPU. DaVinci Resolve does, and if you go for the studio version, it's going to rely heavier on your GPU than the free version. Another important thing to keep in mind is you may want to use your PC for more than one purpose. So I use my PC mostly for video editing, but I also do game on it. So you're going to have to factor in all your uses on deciding which GPU to go for. But for today's build, I've decided to go with the ROG Strix RTX 3080. And you'll see from the benchmarks, this should give us great performance in DaVinci Resolve. To help you decide what power supply to go with, BQuat have a power supply calculator on their website. Whenever I put in all these components, it tells us that our maximum wattage is 645 watts. It is, however, important to remember when you're picking your power supply, you are going to want to allow yourself some headroom, because running at a power supply at 100% all the time isn't very efficient. Your power supply is going to run much hotter and much noisier. So with a combination of an RTX 3080 and a Ryzen 9 CPU, I would recommend an 850 watt power supply. The other really important thing to remember when picking your power supply is to make sure the cables included have enough connectors on it to power everything that you're going to need for your build. So for this build, BQuat have sent out their Dark Power Pro 1200 watt power supply. So this is an incredibly high spec power supply. It's got an 80 plus titanium rating, which is an incredibly high rating, making it very efficient. So over the long term, it's going to save you quite a bit of money on power costs. It's got a whole host of premium features, including being fully digitally controlled. It's got really nice premium individually sleeved cables and a really long list of advanced features. I have made a separate video of unboxing the power supply and covering all the features, and you'll find a link to that in the description. So whenever I'd done all the calculations of what I was going to need from a power point of view for the build, I had asked Be Quiet for their Dark Power 12 850 watt power supply. I got a very pleasant surprise when the 1200 watt Pro model came out, and really there was only one thing to say: thank you. The final item for today's build is some white cable extensions from Cable Mod. Okay, so that's all the parts. Let's get on with the build. The first thing I like doing in any build is to prepare the case. By that I mean removing any panels, dust filters, or anything else that's going to get in our way during the build. I've already done a lot of detailed thermal testing in this case, so I'll share this as well as the main case features as we go along. The first job for us to do is to go ahead and put the feet on the case. You'll notice I've got the case down on a carpeted floor because I think if you put it on its back on top of a table, you'll end up scratching your table during this. So I'm just going to go ahead and line the legs up with the cutouts. To remove the tempered glass side panel, there's a little button on the back we just press in, which releases the panel, and then we can simply lift it up and away. It's the same process with the other side panel. Just push the button in at the back, and then we can lift it up and away. One of the nice things about this case is it offers you quite a few options for building, and it depends on your own individual preferences. At the front of the case and at the top, we have panels which are optimized for sound. They've got lots of noise dampening material, and it's designed to give you as quiet a PC as possible. In the case accessory box, Be Quiet shipped the case with replacement panels for both the front and the top, which are optimized for airflow. Now, I have mentioned that I've done quite a bit of thermal testing. In my previous build, whenever I used the airflow focus panels, CPU temperatures came down by 1 degree at idle and by 2 degrees under load. GPU temperatures came down by 5 degrees at idle and 4 degrees under load. However, using the airflow focus panels were slightly louder by 1 decibel at idle and 2 decibels under load. So weighing all that up, the airflow focus panels are what I'm going to recommend, so I'm going to go ahead and replace these on the case now. To remove the front panel, all we need to do is lift it up, and then we can lift it away. And then if you look at the back of this panel, you can see there's quite a thick layer of noise dampening material. So we can go ahead and slide the airflow focus panel into place. Once we're happy it's in the right place, all we need to do is push down at the top to fix it in place. On the top of the case, the panel is split into two. The first bit is solid with lots of noise dampening material, while the second bit has some vents in it. Our replacement panel is magnetic, so all we need to do is set it down on the top. So taking a look at the case, we can see it comes with 3 PureWings 2 140mm case fans included. We've got one at the rear as an exhaust, and we've got 2 intake fans at the front. Now there is space to fit an additional 140mm fan at the bottom at the front, and we can fit a 140mm fan at the bottom here if we remove this panel, bringing air up and into the case. Now when I did do my original thermal testing, I tried out both these combinations, and actually temperatures were worse with additional fans added in. So this is actually good news for us because we're not actually going to have to move any of these fans or add any extra fans in to the build. We're going to go ahead and install our 360mm AIO at the top, and it's good to see Be Quiet include a removable fan stroke radiator bracket at the top. It's held on with 2 screws, one here and one here. With the screws removed, we can simply pull the radiator bracket out at the front, and you can see it's going to be much easier installing our radiator on the flat table onto the bracket and then bringing the bracket into the case and putting it in. Having a look in the rear compartment of the case, I think the first thing you'll notice is the case comes with an included fan hub, which will accommodate up to 6 3-pin fans. And importantly, the 3 included PureWings 2 fans are already plugged in to the fan hub. We've got a dual 2.5-inch drive mounting bracket here, and then we've got a single 2.5-inch drive mounting bracket. Down the bottom of the case, we've got a hard drive cage, which will accommodate up to 2 3.5-inch drives. In the bottom of the case, we've got an accessory box. I'll go ahead and remove that. In the accessory box, we've got an additional drive tray, which will hold an additional 3.5-inch hard drive. To install it, what we would need to do is to remove one of these 5 covers from the back of the case. So all I would need to do is squeeze these in together to make a space. After installing our drive, we would just simply need to insert it through the gap, and then we would go ahead and secure it into place with the thumb screws. And I'll give you a look at what that looks like from the front. The case comes with one additional drive tray, but you can see there is space for an additional 4 trays, and you can purchase additional ones from BQuat. As we're not going to use any 3.5-inch drives, I'm going to go ahead and remove this. At the rear of the case, we've got a removable power supply bracket which is held on with 4 thumb screws. So what you want to do is secure this to the back of your power supply, and then you're going to be able to slide your power supply straight in from the back of the case. This is our motherboard, and we're going to do as much work with the motherboard as we can while we've got it on a flat table, because it's much easier to work on the table than it is in the cramped confines of the case. So we're going to put our CPU into this socket in the middle of the motherboard. We're going to change the mounting brackets for our cooler. We're going to install our M.2 SSDs behind these heatsinks, and we're going to install our RAM into these sockets here, all before we put the motherboard into the case. So if you look closely at our CPU socket, you'll notice there's a little triangle on the top left-hand corner, and there's a little marking on the motherboard. The reason it's there, it's going to help us orientate our CPU in the socket in the right orientation, and there's going to be a mark on the CPU that we're going to have to line up with this corner. To prepare the motherboard to receive the CPU, all we need to do is slide this lever all the way over to the right hand side. This is our CPU, and what you'll notice is I'm holding it by the edges, and the reason for that is I don't want to damage these gold pins on the underside of the CPU. The other thing to point out, if you look at the corner which is on the top of the screen, it's got a little gold triangle on it. So this is the corner that we're going to need to line up with the mark on the CPU socket. Okay, so I've got the mark on the CPU lined up with the mark on the socket, and all I'm going to do is hover the CPU over the socket, and at one point, like it has just done now, it's going to fall into the socket. I'm not going to go down pushing on the CPU where I can damage the pins. To finish installing the CPU, all we need to do is close over this little lever. And we've now installed our CPU. The AIO that we have uses different mounting brackets, so we need to remove these brackets. Each bracket's held on with 2 screws. Importantly, don't throw these away, because if you want to change your CPU cooler or sell your motherboard, you're going to need them. So the best place to keep them is in the motherboard box. With our AIO, we get a little bag labelled AMD. It's going to contain 4 spacers. Next, we've got 2 of these mounting brackets. If you look closely at each end, there's 2 holes. One is labelled AM4, so we're going to need to fit these screws through the hole labelled AM4. Then all we need to lower it down over the spacers, and then we can go ahead and screw things into place. Okay, same thing for the other side. Our motherboard has 3 M.2 SSD sockets hidden behind these heatsinks. To remove the heatsinks, we're going to need to use the special star-shaped screwdriver which you get in the motherboard accessory box. With the screws removed, we can go ahead and lift off the heatsinks. We just need to be careful with this middle one because it is connected with a wire. So we can now see our 3 M.2 SSD sockets, and just sizing a drive up, it looks like these top 2, the standoff that secures the heatsink is also going to secure the M.2 SSD. In the bottom one, we're going to have to put an additional standoff into here and then use a screw from the motherboard accessory box to secure the drive. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove this covering from where the standoff is going to screw in. And then we can go ahead and screw the standoff into place. This is our M.2 SSD. You'll notice there's gold connectors over to the right hand side which are going to plug into the motherboard. The gold semicircle over to the left hand side is where we're going to secure it to the motherboard. So to install our drive, all we need to do is insert it at a slight angle into the socket. Same thing with our second drive, and then our third drive. As we've mentioned, we're going to have to secure our third drive with a screw, which we're going to get in the motherboard accessory box. Just before we go ahead and put the heatsink back on, there's going to be plastic protection on the back we need to remove. Then if we go ahead and line the heatsink up and secure it again with the screws we removed earlier on. Same thing with our middle heatsink. I'm going to go ahead and remove the plastic protection. Now all three of our M.2 SSDs will run at Gen 4 speeds. The only compromise is because we put a drive into the bottom socket, our bottom by 16 PCIe socket will be deactivated. But that's not a problem for us because we're going to install our graphics card in the top socket. Next thing for us to do is to install our RAM, and it's going to go into these sockets here. If you notice, there's 4 sockets on the motherboard, but we've only got 2 sticks of RAM. It's really important that we don't just pick and choose which of the sockets we install it in. We're going to want to install it in the 2nd and 4th socket along from the CPU. So we just need to open the clips on these sockets. This is our RAM, and what you'll notice, there's gold connectors on the bottom of the RAM. The one over to the right hand side is longer than the one over to the left hand side, so it's really important we line it up in the socket on the right orientation to avoid damage in our hardware. So all we're going to want to do is line the RAM up with the socket. Once we're happy everything is lined up, we just need to apply some firm pressure to the top of the RAM and it will lock into place and the clip will close. Okay, just the same process with our second stick of RAM. Line things up with the socket, lower things into place, and then some firm pressure on the top. And we've now installed our RAM. The next thing for us to do is to go ahead and get our motherboard into the case. Looking at the back of the case, we have got 9 standoffs in 3 rows of 3. Importantly, the middle standoff is slightly different. It doesn't have a screw in it and it's got a protruding point, and it is designed to go through the hole in the middle of the motherboard, holding the motherboard in place and then letting you get the rest of the screws in, so you don't actually put a screw into this middle standoff. I installed my motherboard into the case with the case upright to give you guys a better view of it. You will find it, however, much easier if you put the case down on its back. Okay, so we go ahead and insert the motherboard into the case, lining it up with a cutout at the back. Then what we're going to want to do is to get the middle standoff through the motherboard, and then we just need to secure the motherboard into place with 8 screws. The next thing I like to do in any build is to get our case cables plugged in, and the case cables come from the front I/O and allow it to work. So we've got 2 USB Type A ports in the top of the case, and we need to plug this USB 3.0 header into our motherboard to allow them to work. Likewise, we've got a Type C port on the top of the case, and we need to plug our Type C cable in to allow it to work. We've got a headphone and microphone jack, and we need to plug our HD audio into the motherboard to allow it to work. Then we've got these front panel connectors. These control things like the power switch, power LED, hard drive indicator LED, and reset button. And obviously we need to plug these into the motherboard to allow these functions on the case to work. Because our case has a fan hub, there's one extra case cable that we need to plug in. It's a standard 4-pin fan connector which we need to plug into the chassis fan headers on our motherboard, and then it's going to allow our motherboard to control the speed of the fans. On the top of the case you've got a button. If you leave it set to auto, it's going to allow your motherboard to control the speed of the fans. And then there is also 3 individual fan speeds, so you can actually control the fan speeds directly from the case rather than using the motherboard. So the first cable to plug in is our HD audio cable, and it's going to go in this header down the far left hand side of the motherboard. So I'm just going to go ahead and pass the cable in from the back and then slide it along to the side. If you look closely at the cable and also the header itself, you'll notice there's a pin missing and there's also a hole missing on the cable. So we are going to need to line things up the right way, which is with the HD audio text facing down the way. Okay, so that's that plugged in, and then we can just go ahead and pull the excess cable through to the back. Next I'm going to go ahead and bring the fan cable coming from our fan hub through. And we've got 2 fan headers down the bottom of the motherboard, so I'm going to go ahead and plug into these. And again, we'll pull the excess cable through to the back. Next, we've got our front panel connectors, which are down the bottom right-hand side of the motherboard. So you need to refer really closely to the diagram in the motherboard manual to make sure you're plugging these into the right pins. What I would recommend doing is starting with the bottom row and working your way up. If you start with the top row, you're not going to be able to see the pins in the bottom row to plug them in. In the close-up in the video, it looks like I've done things the opposite way round, but that was just so you could see all the cables being plugged in. Okay, starting in the bottom row, working from left to right, the first pin is for hard drive LED positive, followed by hard drive LED negative. So we're going to need to plug it in with the text on the cables facing down the way. The next two pins are for our reset button. It doesn't matter which way this goes in, but I'm just going to plug it in with the text facing down the way. Moving up to the top row, working from left to right again, the first pin is for power LED positive, followed by power LED negative. Next to this we've got our power switch. Again, it doesn't matter which way it goes in, but to keep things nice and tidy, I'm going to plug it in with the text facing down the way. And then we can go ahead and pull the access cable through to the back. Next we've got our USB 3.0 cable, so I'm going to bring it through this cutout, and we've got a header just here below our 24-pin connector. Importantly, there's a little notch on the right hand side of the header, and we've got a notch on our cable, so it's important we line things up the right way. So take care when plugging this cable in. It's the one where you're most likely to damage the pins on the motherboard, and if you damage the pins, your front I/O is not going to work. And then we can go ahead and pull the access cable through to the back. Just below that we've got our Type-C connector, so I'm going to bring it through the cutout, line things up, push into place, and again pull the access cable through to the back. This is our Dark Power Pro 12 power supply, and as you can see it's a fully modular power supply. So we're just going to need to go ahead and plug the cables in that we're going to use. Okay, so starting off with our 24-pin cable for our motherboard, and it's got two different connectors which are going to go in to here. Although we're not going to install any SATA drives in the build, we are going to need SATA power for the fan hub in our case, but also for our AIO. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in a SATA cable. Our motherboard needs two 8-pin EPS cables to provide additional power for the CPU, so I'm going to go ahead and plug in two cables. Our graphics card is going to require three 8-pin connectors to provide power. And if you look at one of our PCIe cables, it comes with two 6-pin plus 2-pin connectors. So one cable would provide enough power for two of those 8-pin connectors. The only problem with that is if we use the daisy chain connectors, we're not going to be distributing the power over all our rails. So what we quite recommend, if you're only going to need two or less 8-pin connectors, plug your cable into this header here and you're fine to use the daisy chain, because this header is going to distribute the power across two of the rails in the power supply. If you need three or more connectors, they recommend starting over here and using each of these individual rails. So this is going to distribute the power over three different rails in the power supply. So I would actually plug individual cables in rather than using the daisy chain method. Okay, so we'll go ahead and plug three of the cables in for the graphics card. Just to mention, we do have one additional cable we could plug into the power supply if we wanted, and this is our overclocking key. What you do, if you plug this into your power supply and turn the switch to on, it will convert the 6 12-volt rails in the power supply to a single rail. I'm quite happy to leave the power supply in a multi-rail configuration, so I'm not going to go ahead and install this. So you can see the cables that come with the power supply are of incredibly high quality and they're all individually sleeved. You do get some cable combs in the box, but because I'm not planning on bringing these cables through to the front of the case, I'm not going to go ahead and install the cable combs. I do have some white cable extensions, so I'm just going to go ahead and plug these in. Next, we just need to go ahead and secure the removable bracket to the power supply. We're now ready to go ahead and get our power supply into the case. Just before we do, it's important to point out this is our power supply's intake fan. The power supply is going to get cool air from the bottom of the case, and there is a dust filter on the bottom. So we're going to want to install it with the fan facing down the way, so like this. So if we go ahead and pull all the cables through, and then with all the cables through, we should simply just be able to slide the power supply into the back of the case. All we need to do then is secure the power supply into place with the thumb screws. Next thing to do is to plug in our power cables. So we've got two 8-pin EPS connectors up the top of the motherboard, so we'll go ahead and plug in our cables. So it's just a matter of lining things up. And then these cables have cable combs on them, which are going to help organize the cables. And then we can just pull the excess cable through to the back. Okay, same thing with our second connector. Okay, next we can go ahead and bring our motherboard 24-pin connector through the cutout. Importantly, there is a little notch on the right hand side of the header, and we've got a clip on the cable, so they need to line up. Once we're happy everything is lined up, we can just go ahead and push into place. And then again, we have some cable combs on the cable, which are going to help organize the cable. The only additional case cable for us to plug in is the SATA connector coming from our fan hub. So it needs power, so we need to plug it into one of the SATA connectors from our power supply. The next thing for us to do is to start work on our AIO. So I'm going to go ahead and put the fans on. We're going to have the front of the fans facing into the case because it's going to be an exhaust at the top of the case. Then we've got some long radiator screws that come with the AIO. Coming from our three fans, we've got three 4-pin fan connectors, and all these fans are going to need to go into the CPU fan header on our motherboard. But that's not a problem because Be Quiet include a triple fan splitter cable, so we just need to go ahead and plug these in. There we go, we've now got a single 4-pin fan connector which is going to go into our CPU fan header. Taking a look at the rest of the connectors coming from the AIO, from our water block we've got a 3-pin fan connector, and from the pump itself we've got another 3-pin fan connector, and importantly this is the pump on the tubes, there's no actual pump in the water block. So this cable is to power the pump, whereas this cable is to power the white LED lighting on the water block. So Be Quiet include a double 3-pin splitter cable to SATA. So the SATA is going to power the LED lighting, and it's also going to power our pump, which means our pump is just going to run at 100% all the time, and we're not going to be able to use our motherboard to control the speed. But that's not a problem because in general I will run my AIO pump at 100%, and even if I do have motherboard control, I don't adjust it. So we'll go ahead and plug these cables in. Okay, so that's everything connected up. So we've this cable to plug into a SATA connector from our power supply, and the other cable coming from the fans into the CPU fan header. And I really think this is one of the easiest AIOs to install. Next we can go ahead and put on the removable radiator bracket. Next we just need to reinsert the radiator bracket at the top of the case. And we can go ahead and secure things with the 2 screws we removed earlier on. The next thing to do is to plug the cable coming from the 3 fans in the radiator into the CPU fan header. So we'll go ahead and line things up. Okay, that's it plugged in. Then all I'm going to do is pull all the excess cables coming from the fans through to the back of the case. The next thing to do is to apply a pea-sized amount of thermal paste to the centre of the CPU. Just before we go ahead and install our water block, we need to remove the plastic protection from the back. Then we just need to go ahead and line the water block up with the bracket we fitted earlier on. And then once we've got things lined up, we just need to tighten things up. Next, we just need to feed the cables coming from the pump and water block through to the back of the case. And then we can go ahead and plug the SATA connector coming from our AIO into the SATA cable from our power supply. Next thing for us to do is to install our graphics cards. We're going to need to remove the second and third slot cover from the top. To prepare the motherboard to receive the graphics card, we just need to open this little clip here. Then we can go ahead and line the graphics card up with the slot. And once we're happy everything is lined up, all we need to do is apply some firm pressure to the graphics card and it will lock into place and the clip will close. Then all we need to do is secure the graphics card using the thumb screws we removed earlier on. Next we just need to do the power supply cables for our graphics card through the cutout at the bottom, and then we can go ahead and plug them in. So again, we've got some cable combs on the extension cable, so we can go ahead and use these to organise our cables. Okay, the next thing for us to do is to tidy up this mess of cables so we can get the side panel back on. Importantly, be quiet to include plenty of Velcro cable straps to help manage the cables. And again, we've got plenty of space down the bottom of the case for our power supply cables. We can now go ahead and put the panels back on. So that's the build complete. Next thing for us to do is to turn it on and see if it works. Importantly, I have loaded a Windows 10 bootable USB drive into the back of the PC. If you don't know how to make one of those, I've done a video on it and you'll find a link to that in the description. Okay, here goes. So that's good signs. We've got fans spinning, lights on the motherboard. So next thing for us to do is just to keep an eye on the screen and see what happens. And we've got the ASRock and Razer logo appearing, which again is an excellent sign. So that's us through to the Windows installer screen, which means our PC has found the bootable USB drive in the back of the PC and booted off it, because importantly, none of the SSDs that we have installed have an operating system in them. Next thing, I'm going to show you how to install Windows 10, but to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to flip over to the screen mode. So over the next lot of screens, I'm going to pick the options that are relevant to me. Obviously, if you have different options, you should pick the ones that are relevant to you. I'm from the United Kingdom, so I'm going to click Next. I'm going to click Install Now. So if you've got a Windows 10 product key, you can go ahead and put it into the box. If you don't have one, click I don't have a product key, and then you can select the version of Windows you're going to get a product key for in the future. I'm going to go ahead and put my product key in here. We need to accept the terms, and then we're going to go for a custom install. Okay, so we can see our three M.2 SSDs. So drive 0 seems to be our team group drive, drive 1 seems to be our Samsung, and drive 2 our Sabrent. So I'm going to go ahead and install this on our team group drive. So I'm going to select drive 0 and click Next. So this next step will take a little bit of time, so I'm going to go ahead and speed it up, and then between all the steps I'll speed everything up for you. Okay, I'm from the United Kingdom. I'm going to click yes and yes again. I'm going to skip a secondary keyboard. I'm going to go ahead and connect to the internet, and then we'll click Next. I'm going to set up for personal use, click next. If you've got a Microsoft account, you can go ahead and put your details in here. If you don't have one, you can create one. If you don't want to create an online account, you can create an offline account. I'm going to put my details in now. I'm going to create a PIN to log in. I'm going to click don't use online speech recognition. Yes to let apps use my location. Yes to find my device. Just the basic data. No thinking. No again. No again. I'm just going to skip this for now and skip for now. I'm going to only save files to this PC. I'm going to say no thanks and not now. Okay, so that's Windows installed. The first thing I like to do in any build is to get Windows fully up to date. So we go ahead and click on the Windows icon, click on the settings, click on updates and security, and click on Windows updates. And then we're going to click on check for updates. What will happen is Windows will find a whole load of updates and it'll start to download and install them. It'll probably need to restart a number of times while installing the updates, but we're going to let things finish, keep coming back and checking for more updates, and then we're only going to move forward once there's no more updates available. Okay, that's Windows fully up to date. Whenever I click on check for updates, there's no further updates available. The next thing I want to do is to get all our M.2 SSDs to show up, because if we go over to here and click on this PC, what you'll notice is actually only 2 of our drives are showing up. We've got our local disk C, which is our team group drive, and also our Samsung 980 Pro is showing up. I think this is probably because I had previously formatted this drive and hadn't erased it again. Normally when you get a drive that you haven't used before, it won't show up in Windows, and that's why our Sabrent drive isn't showing up. So I'll go ahead and show you how to get all the drives to show up. So what we need to do is go down the bottom and type in disk management, and then click on the create and format hard disk partition. It's going to give us a little prompt, and like I say, if I hadn't used the Samsung drive previously, it would also be showing up here asking me to initialize the disk. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then if we work our way down, we'll see our Sabrent drive showing up as unallocated space. So all I need to do is right click on this, new simple volume, next, next. If we want to change the letter, we can. From here it's down as E. I'm going to leave it as that and click next. We can name the drive and click next and finish. And what you'll now see, if we go back to this PC, all 3 of our drives are now showing up. Okay, the next thing I want to do is install our drivers. So we're over on our motherboards page on ASRock's website. We're on the support tab and the download tab, and we can see all the drivers that are available. Don't worry about trying to remember the web link. You'll find all this in the description. So I'm going to go ahead and download the audio drivers, the killer Bluetooth driver, the chipset driver, the LAN driver. We'll download the killer suite. I'm not planning on using RAID or SATA at all in this, so I'm not going to download the next 2. The VGA driver, we've got a dedicated graphics card. We're not going to use integrated graphics, so we don't need this. We'll download the ASRock motherboard utility, the killer control center, Nahimic 3. Okay, so we head over to our downloads folder. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to right click and click extract all, extract. And then I'm going to repeat this for each of the drivers. That's all the files extracted. What I'm going to do now is just go ahead and delete all the compressed folders. And then we'll just go ahead and install these one by one. So we'll click on the audio drivers, click on the setup, click yes, click next. And we're going to need to restart our computer. I always think it's a good idea to do it at the time the pop-up appears rather than leaving it for later. So we'll click on finish and restart. Okay, we'll click on the killer LAN, click yes, next, install, and finish. Okay, killer Bluetooth, go ahead and click next, accept the terms, click next. We're going to go for a typical install and click on install, and we're going to click on yes and click finish. Okay, chipset drivers, click on the application, and click yes. So we're going to go ahead and click on install. And then we need to restart our computer, so we'll do that now. Okay, we'll install the killer suite. Click yes, click next. We're going to accept the terms, next. And we're going to go for complete install, next, install. And we're going to click on finish. So a pop-up's come out about the Killer Control Center. I think we've already got that downloaded. So we go back to the downloads. Yep, there's the Killer Control Center. So we'll get to it eventually. We'll install the motherboard utility. Click yes. Click next, 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 install. And again, we're going to need to restart our computer, so we'll go ahead and do that now. Okay, we'll install the Killer Control Center. So again, it's just a shortcut, so we'll go ahead and click on launch. And then HEMIC 3. Click on the setup. Click yes. Next, install. And again, we're going to need to restart our computer, so we'll go ahead and do that now. Okay, the next driver for us to get is the driver for our graphics card. So we're over on NVIDIA's web page. We can either get the driver by itself, or we can go ahead and download the GeForce Experience. This is what I normally do, so I'll show you how to do it. We can click on download now. Okay, we can go ahead and open the file. Click yes. I'm going to click on agree and install. Okay, so if you've got an NVIDIA account, go ahead and put your details in. If you don't have one, you can create one. I'll go ahead and put my details in now. I'm just going to go ahead and skip the tour for now. And then if we go ahead and click on drivers. Now it's given us a little prompt here to change our driver preference, so this is useful. So if we go ahead and click on these three dots, it's got game ready drivers selected. Now obviously we're building a video editing PC, so we should download the studio driver. So I'm going to click on studio driver. And it's found the latest version of the NVIDIA Studio driver, so I'm going to click download. Okay, we can click on Express Installation, click yes. And then it's very normal for the screen to flicker as the drivers are being installed, so don't be alarmed by this. Okay, we can click on close. Okay, so that's all the drivers that we're going to need to install. The next thing I want to do is download the latest version of the BIOS. So we click on the BIOS tab. We can see here is the latest version from the 28th of January 2021. Now I'm not sure which version is installed on our motherboard, but whenever we enter the BIOS, if there's an earlier version, I can go ahead and update it with this file. So I'm going to go ahead and download it now, and you can see the additional features it offers. In general, I don't recommend updating the BIOS unless you really need to. For example, if your computer is not running well, or the new version offers features that you're going to want. For example, you're getting the resizable bar option coming up in this one. The reason I say this is if something goes wrong during the BIOS update, you can actually brick your motherboard. So we'll go ahead and download this. And then if we head over to our downloads folder, so I'm going to extract this. And then we can see the actual BIOS file. So I'm going to click on this, copy. And what I have done is I've plugged an external USB drive into the PC, and I'm going to paste the BIOS file onto here. Okay, to enter the BIOS, what we need to do is restart our computer. And then as the ASRock logo appears, we need to press the delete key. It can be quite hard to time, so I normally wait until the screen goes black and then start pressing delete. So I'm going to start pressing delete now. Okay, and that's us into the BIOS. So the first thing I can see is our motherboard is running version 1.1. We've got 1.4 installed in the USB drive, so it is worth us going ahead and updating that. Before you would make any changes in the BIOS, it's a good idea to do a BIOS update if you're planning to, because any changes that you made will often be erased whenever you do the update. So we go ahead and click on Tools, and then we're going to click on Instant Flash. So it looks like it's found our version of the BIOS 1.4. I'm going to click on Update. It's asking us, are we sure we want to update this? So we're going to click on Yes. What's really important during the BIOS update is that your computer doesn't lose power. If it loses power, you can actually brick your motherboard. So I'm going to go ahead and click yes. Okay, we just need to press enter to reboot the system. Okay, so we're back into the BIOS after the update, and you can now see we're running the latest version 1.4. Now, one of the things I've noticed since the update is the chipset fan has stopped spinning, and that was one of the features ASRock mentioned in the description of the new BIOS update. So that was worth doing just for that, because there's much less noise coming from the PC already. So having a look at the other things here, so we can see our processor, we can see our RAM, and one of the nice things about the Team Group RAM is it's meant to run at 3200 megahertz without enabling XMP. So it looks like it's doing just what it's advertised to do. So it's one less step you're going to need to do. If you don't want to come into the BIOS at all, your RAM would be running at the advertised speed without doing anything with it. The next thing I want to do is to adjust our fan curves. So we head over to the hardware monitor. So what we can see is the CPU fan, which is the 3 fans in the radiator, are running round about 1200 revs per minute. Our chassis fan number 2, which is where we have plugged our fan hub into, is running round about 1000 revs per minute. So that looks like those fans are running at full speed, because the PureWings 2 fans run at round about 1000 revs per minute at full speed. So we are going to have to make a few adjustments. So heading down here, we can see our CPU fan is running in standard mode. If I click here, there's other options where I can change it. I can run it to full speed, performance mode, or silent mode, or I can customize things individually. There is a better place to customize things, and I'll show you this in a minute. If we want to get into our other fan settings, we can click here for CPU fan 2 and chassis fan configuration. And again, we can make any adjustments that we need to in here for any of our fans. One of the best ways, I think, to adjust the fans in an ASRock motherboard is to use its fan tuning. So if I click on fan tuning, what it will do is it will find the lowest it can run each of the fans at. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. This will take a couple of minutes. Okay, so we can see the adjustments it's made. We'll click on OK. And then if we head back to the top, we can have a look at our fan speeds. So what we can see, the CPU fan speed has been reduced significantly. It's down by about half. And like I say, this has always been a great way I've found of reducing the speeds. Our chipset fan is running again, but that is because the graphics card is roasting hot. What I found with the new 3000 series graphics cards is they have a 0 fan mode. So they actually get really quite hot before the fans switch on. And they actually provide a lot of heat round about the chipset and cause the fan to go on. So I normally will adjust the fans in the graphics card so they run all the time, preventing them from getting hot and preventing the chipset fan from coming on. So I'll come back and look at that in a minute. But what we can see is our chassis fan 2 is still running at full speed, and these PureWings 2 fans run 1000 revs per minute at full speed. Now, just to show you that it is running at full speed, on the top of the case we have some buttons where we can control the fan. So I'm going to go ahead and flip it from auto, which is allowing motherboard control, to speed number 1. And I can hear the noise in the background just disappearing. And you can see there on speed number 1, the speed of our chassis fans have been reduced down significantly. I can put it up to number 2. And you should see the fan speeds increase a little bit. And then if I go to setting number 3, that's going to run our fans at full speed. So I'm going to go ahead and put things back to auto mode and see if we can make any adjustments to the fans. This is obviously because the fans are plugged into the fan hub, and for some reason the motherboard is having trouble controlling the fan hub. So I click on the CPU fan 2 and chassis fan configuration, and we'll work our way down to chassis fan number 2. So it's running in auto mode. So I'm going to go ahead and change that and see if PWM mode makes a difference. I don't hear any reduction in the noise, but I'll go back and check. No, we're still running at full speed. Okay, so we'll have to try DC mode. So we're still running at full speed. So this is obviously a problem just with the fan hub in the case. I do have the Silent Base 802 and I've used it with another motherboard, and the fan hub did work well in PWM mode. For whatever reason, it doesn't seem to be compatible with this motherboard. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to save the settings I've got for now. I'm going to turn the computer off, and then I'm going to plug the fans directly into the motherboard, and then we'll come back into the BIOS and make some adjustments. So to save what we've done so far, I'm going to click on Exit, Save Changes and Exit, and click on Yes. Okay, that's us back into the BIOS, and I've plugged all the chassis fans directly into the motherboard, and you can see they're running at much lower speed. Our CPU fan's still running pretty slow, and because I've had the PC switched off for a little while and the graphics card has cooled down, the chipset fan has stopped spinning. So I'm just going to go and reset up the fans again because they're now plugged into the motherboard. So we head down and have a look at the fans. Chassis fan number 1, we've got something plugged into. It's currently running in auto mode. I'm just going to make sure it's in DC mode because it's a 3-pin fan connector. It's currently monitoring the temperature on the motherboard. I think I'm going to set it to CPU. I'm just going to repeat the same thing with number 2. It's running in DC mode, working off the motherboard. We'll change that to CPU. Chassis fan number 3, we don't have anything plugged into at the moment, so there's no reason to change that. And number 4, I'm going to change to DC mode, again working off the CPU. Okay, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to rerun the fan tuning because the fans are now going to be different than what it would have detected before. So we'll click on fan tuning and click on OK. So we head back and have a look at our fans. We can see they're running at more reasonable speeds. The other place that we can adjust our fan curves is using the Fantastic tuning. So we can click on each of the fans. You can see our CPU fan curve, and we've got the individual points on the curve that we can make any adjustments to. We need to drag each of these points. You can see at 40 degrees the fan runs at 26%, it's in PWM mode. At 60 degrees it increases to 50%, 75, 90%, and again at 75 it stays at 90%. Looking at our other fans, so for example there's chassis fan 1, because it's in DC mode it has to run at a slightly higher base speed, but that's the actual fan curve that it's going to run on. Okay, so that's all the changes I want to make on the BIOS. To save our settings, we need to click Exit, Save Changes and Exit, and Yes. And then the PC will boot back into Windows. The first thing I want to do is confirm our RAM is running at the correct speed. So I right click on the Start menu, click on Task Manager, click on More Details, click on Performance, and click on Memory. So we can see our memory is running at 3200 megahertz as it showed in the BIOS. Okay, so our PC is now running well and running nice and quiet, but we want to get it looking good as well. So we're going to need to move on to the RGB software. So it's Razer Synapse 3 we're going to want, so we'll click Download Now. We can go ahead and open the file, click Yes. We're going to go ahead and click on Install. Okay, we can click on Get Started. I'm just going to click on Continue as a Guest. I'm going to click Continue as a Guest again, and I'm going to skip things. Okay, so we go ahead and click on our motherboard and then click on the lighting. We've got all the settings here that we can adjust. So at the moment it's set to spectrum cycling. I'm going to go into here and go for a static color. At the moment it's set to green. I would like it to be white. So I'm going to click on white, and then you'll notice that everything has changed to white on the motherboard. We've got a whole range of different effects that we can pick. So for example, let's go for breathing. And there it's gone back to green in breathing. We want to pick a random color, we can do that as well. We've also got more advanced effects here that we can go to and use the Chroma Studio. All I want to do is set the motherboard to white, so I'm just going to go back to the quick effects, go for the static color, and then click on white and leave everything set to white because I think that's going to work best for this particular build. So what you'll notice, our graphics card still has a rainbow effect on it. If we like that, we could leave it at that, but I think it's going to look much better in white, so we're going to need to download some software from ASUS. Okay, so that's us over on our graphics cards page on ASUS's website, and if we scan down to the bottom, we're looking in the utilities and we're looking for the Armoury crate. So we go ahead and click on download and click on open file. Click yes. So we've got an option here. We can install the full Armoury crate or just the Aura creator, and it's really only the Aura creator that we need to control the lighting. So I'm going to click on it and click start. Okay, so that's it installed. We can click on launch creator. I'm going to accept the terms. I'm just going to skip this. Okay, so what we're going to want to do, we're going to want to click on PC components and we can see our graphics card here. So I'm going to want to apply a static color, so I'm going to drag this down to the bar. And you can see at the moment it's set to red. So I'll click on the red, and if we want to make this white, all we need to do is drag this circle up to the top left-hand corner, and then we're going to click on OK. To save and apply, we just need to click Save and Apply and click Save. And what you'll notice now, our graphics card has changed to white. So I did mention with the new 3000 series graphics cards, particularly this overclock Strix edition, it does get quite hot when it's running in the zero fan mode. So I find the easiest way to adjust the fans is to use the MSI Afterburner software. I also use this for recording the frame rate when I'm running game benchmarks. So I'm going to go ahead and download this. We can go ahead and open the file. Click yes. Okay, next. We're going to accept the terms, click next, 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 install. We're going to click on OK, next, I accept, next, next, install. Okay, so this is our MSI Afterburner software. ASUS do have their own package where you can adjust the graphics card fan curves. I've just always used this and I use it for recording my benchmarks as well. So it makes sense for me just to have the one package. So we click on the settings and click on the fan, and I'm going to click on Enable User Defined Software Fan Control. And I'm just going to use the stock fan curve and click on Apply. And what you'll notice now, our fan speed has kicked up. I just find this a great way to prevent the chipset fan from kicking in. I find the fans running at around about 40%, which they do tend to run at. It just prevents the card from heating up. You can see the card was up at 45 degrees. And if the card doesn't heat up, it doesn't heat up the chipset, and then the chipset fan doesn't need to come on. And the fans on the graphics card are so quiet, you can't actually hear them running at 40%. But when the chipset fan kicks in, it's incredibly loud and you can hear it running. So I would always leave this running when the PC's at idle, and particularly when you're video editing, you don't want to hear that chipset fan whining away. Okay, so now we get on to the fun stuff. We can finally get down to video editing. So we're over on Blackmagic Design's webpage and we're at the DaVinci Resolve. So DaVinci Resolve 17 has recently come out of beta, so that's what I would recommend downloading. And as we've mentioned, there's two different versions. There's the free version, which is quite a good package by itself, and there's also the studio version. I'm going to download the studio version because I have a license key for it. If you don't have a license key or you just want to try it out, go ahead and get the free version, and the installation process is going to be exactly the same. I'm just going to skip filling my details in and click on download only. And there, it's going to go ahead and download. Okay, so we head over to our download folder and we're going to go ahead and extract all. Extract. Okay, we can go ahead and click on DaVinci Resolve. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click yes and click on install. So it says we're going to need to restart our computer. I'm going to go ahead and click yes. Okay, so I've got a project loaded up in DaVinci Resolve. It was actually the unboxing and overview of the motherboard we've used for this PC build. So if I scan through the timeline, it's in full 4K and the playback is in full 4K. You can see that it's buttery smooth. There's no issues at all scanning through that. If I hit play, let's see, I'll pick a clip where there's actually a little bit of movement in it. If we hit play here, you can see we're getting playback in full 25 frames per second. Just go to full screen and you can see actually everything's of fairly good quality. So again, although this is a very simple project, the computer has no trouble handling it in full 4K, and this is Blackmagic Raw that we're using. So what I want to do is show you some of the differences between the free and the paid version. So if we head over to Delivered tab, we're going to call it Motherboard 1, and we're going to, let's see, we'll export this and we'll go to a different drive. The projects I have on the Sabrent Rocket, so we'll export out to D. And we're going to export as an MP4. We'll leave that as it is. I'm going to use the NVIDIA. Now, one of the advantages is as an encoder, you can use your graphics card in the studio version, but you can't in the free version. So I'm going to show you the difference it makes here. So we're using NVIDIA. We're going to go in full Quad HD, 25 frames per second, and we're going to leave all the settings on high. So we'll add this over to the render queue and we'll hit render all. And we'll keep an eye on the time it takes to render this. Okay, so that's that rendered in 2 minutes and 59 seconds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over here and change the encoder to native. So it's going to use the CPU as an encoder rather than it being able to use our GPU. And this is the only option you would have in the free version. It does use the GPU for other functions, but you won't be able to use it to render. Okay, so you can see the difference here. This time it was 3 minutes and 57 seconds compared to 2 minutes and 59 seconds. So that was 32% longer. Now, obviously this is a really simple project, as you can see. If we go back into the edit, there's very little actually in this project. It's quite short as well. It's only just over 8 minutes long, and there's only very basic color grading in it. Obviously, if you were to multiply that 32% up with a longer project, that could be a significant amount of time. And the other thing to remember is we've got a really good CPU, so it's going to do the rendering quite well. If you had a much lower quality CPU, much less cores, it could take even longer. The other thing to point out though, with the free version, you are getting a very usable program. What we'll do now, we'll close DaVinci Resolve down and we'll head over to Puget Systems and get their benchmark for DaVinci Resolve. Okay, we're over on Puget Systems webpage and they've got their DaVinci Resolve benchmark. And remember at the start of the video when we were talking through the parts, I showed you some of the benchmark results. So this is the benchmark that they've been running. So we can go ahead and click on download. So this will run their basic benchmark. If we want to run their extended benchmark, we're going to download the extended assets. So I'm going to go ahead and download these as well. Okay, so once the files are downloaded, we can right click on them and go to extract all. I'm just going to change the folder that saves to. So we'll save it over here in our 980 Pro and we'll click select and then we'll go extract. Okay, just the same thing with the extended files, right click, extract all. And then again, I'll change the location to D and select folder and extract. Okay, so we're now over in the D folder. I'm just going to copy this extended file. And if we go into the benchmark, into the assets, and then paste. So in here, we've got the standard files, and all we've really done is add in the extended files as well. Okay, we can now go ahead and run the benchmark by clicking here. So you can choose which benchmark you run. The standard is selected, but because we have downloaded the extended assets, it makes sense for us to go ahead and run it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and click on Run Benchmark. So it's given us a pop-up here. It's going to tell us things are going to take a little bit of time. We'll go for yes. Okay, that's the results in. We've got an extended score of 1,403. So I'm going to go ahead and click yes to view the full results. So you can see our extended score, our standard score, 4K, 8K, GPU effects score, and Fusion score. So the results by themselves probably don't mean very much, so let's have a look at Puget Systems benchmarks to compare our system to some of the other systems they have tested. Okay, so let's compare our results to the Puget Systems benchmarks. They were looking at the Ryzen 5000 series CPUs, and let's see, out of interest, they actually used an RTX 3080, so the same as us. Looking at their other hardware, I suppose the big difference is they actually had more RAM than us. They were running 64 gigabytes. So comparing our results to their results, so the 5900, it got a score of 1320, and that was their extended score. So we beat that with 1403. Moving over to the 4K media score, they got 120, we got 118. 8K media score, they were getting 147, we've got 130. Importantly, our system only had 32 gigabytes of RAM, and they were recommending a minimum of 64 for editing in 8K, so our system really wasn't set up for this. Looking at the Fusion score, they got 124, we got 175, which is quite a significant improvement. Finally, the GPU effects score, they got 137, and we beat them by 1 at 138. If we want to get more data, we can go ahead and click on the raw results. And then it's going to give us the results for each of the tests that it's performed. And again, on Puget Systems website, you'll be able to compare each of the tests they have done in detail against these. So the benchmarks are really useful, and it shows that this is an absolute beast of a video editing PC. So obviously, if you don't want a PC that's as powerful as this, or don't need one that's as powerful, you can use the benchmarks to help guide which components you're going to get for yourself. The other important thing to mention, although I haven't provided any benchmarks on testing gaming performance, it's going to be an absolute beast of a gaming PC as well, given how we've built it. And this takes us back to what I said at the start. Quite often there can be no difference at all between a video editing PC or a gaming PC. There's just a few small tweaks in certain areas. So I've had great fun putting the PC together, and I'd like to thank all the companies that have sent out parts for the build. As well, I would like to thank Puget Systems for letting me show you their graphs and run the benchmark to show you how this PC performs compared to their library of benchmarks. So hopefully you found this video useful. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.